Across the northern reaches of Canada, people disappear without witnesses, without signals, and without clear explanations. Small aircraft fail to arrive. Hunters leave camp and never return. Tracks end where the land continues. These cases are not rare, and they are not clustered in one place or one season. They unfold across tundra, forest, ice, and water, often far from roads, cameras, or reliable communication. Search teams respond with aircraft, ground crews, and planning models designed to cover vast distances. Maps are drawn, lines are flown, areas are searched repeatedly under changing conditions. And yet, many of these disappearances remain unresolved, not because searches were careless or incomplete, but because the environment itself resists clarity. Cold coordinates on a wide map. A disappearance in the northern provinces and territories rarely begins with a dramatic moment. It often starts as a late return. A hunter does not come back to a cabin outside Kugluktuk. A small aircraft does not check in after a fuel stop. A snow machine track stops appearing on the usual lake crossing. By the time a call is made, the first useful detail is usually the last known point, and that point is often only approximate, based on habit and inference rather than a recorded position. In Canada, the first organized response depends on what is believed to have happened and where. Federal search and rescue coordination runs through joint rescue coordination centers, which operate continuously and task aircraft and other federal resources when an incident meets their mandate or when other agencies request help. JRCC Victoria covers British Columbia and the Yukon, while JRCC Trenton covers the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. In practice, this means the Great White North is split across regions whose boundaries do not match the lived routes of people moving across rivers, sea ice, and tundra. Many missing person searches in the north begin under territorial or provincial responsibility, often with police as the coordinating authority and with volunteer ground teams supporting. When conditions or distance require aircraft, hoists, or satellite beacon work, federal resources may be requested. This layered system is functional, but it creates a handoff problem at the worst time. Different organizations collect information in different formats, and each hour changes what the ground will hold. In winter, a light snowfall can soften edges on tracks within a day. In spring, overflow and meltwater can erase them within minutes. The scale is a constant pressure. JRCC Trenton's search and rescue region includes much of the Canadian Arctic, an area measured in millions of square kilometers. Even when aircraft are available, they must be routed from bases that may be far away, through weather that can close ceilings and reduce visibility without warning. The north also compresses the search window. Darkness in winter, low sun angles, drifting snow, and blowing spindrift narrow what observers can reliably see. A search pattern on paper remains steady. The ability to detect a person, a canoe, or wreckage inside that pattern does not. In the early stages, coordinators try to convert uncertainty into a defined area. If a person had a satellite messenger, an emergency locator transmitter, or a registered beacon, the work can shift quickly from broad searching to directed response. Canada's federal system relies heavily on COSPA-SARSAT monitoring for distress beacons, routed through the Canadian Mission Control Centre and the JRCCs. When a signal is present and current, it can narrow the problem into coordinates, timing, and drift. When there is no signal, or when a device never activates, the search becomes an exercise in probabilities, terrain funnels, prevailing wind, water flow, and the simple fact that people do not travel a straight line. Even when a beacon exists, it does not guarantee a recoverable trail. A device can be left behind in a sled bag. Batteries fail in cold. Antennas break. A person may not trigger an emergency function because they do not believe they are in danger, or because their hands cannot manage fine movements. Search teams then fall back on what can be seen and what can be reconstructed. In northern settings, that reconstruction is often fragile because there are fewer witnesses. Many trips are solitary by design. Many routes are not filed anywhere beyond a brief message to family, sometimes without a time expectation that prompts immediate concern. Volunteers extend the reach of the system, especially from the air. The Civil Air Search and Rescue Association is a national volunteer organization that supports the Royal Canadian Air Force with trained spotters and, at times, aircraft and crews, depending on local arrangements and tasking. These crews add eyes and local aviation experience, but their work is still limited by weather, daylight, fuel range, and the ability to identify small signs against vast ground. A dark jacket on a dark rock field does not stand out. A broken branch line in a willow thicket can look like hundreds of other branch lines. On the ground, local knowledge can be decisive. and it is not always formalized as a clue. The Canadian Rangers are a reserve component drawn from remote communities, and their practical value in search situations often comes from familiarity with travel corridors, river behavior, wind exposure, and what changes look like in a familiar landscape. They can move light and self-sufficient across terrain that slows outside responders. This helps find people who are still within reach. It does less for cases where time has passed and the environment has continued its normal work of covering, shifting, and breaking down physical traces. Official searches are sometimes suspended while uncertainty remains. Nunavut media has documented cases where RCMP and partners ended active searching for missing hunters when repeated efforts did not locate the person. In August 2016, Nunatsiaq News reported that search efforts were suspended for Alan Kudluk Jr., who left Kugluktuk by all-terrain vehicle to go hunting, and was reported overdue the next day. The stated facts in such reports are usually spare: when the person left, when they were overdue, what assets were used, and that the search did not find them. The restraint in those lines reflects a practical reality. Once a defined area has been searched under available conditions, repeating the same passes can become less effective than waiting for new information. In aviation-related disappearances, the landscape can keep the answer out of sight, even when an aircraft is found. In October 2017, Alaska Reporting described a case along the Yukon River where an airplane was located downriver from a village, but the pilot was still missing. Water adds its own logic. Current, silt, seasonal debris, and the long distances a body or light wreckage can travel without being seen from shore. Rivers also change shape. Cutbanks collapse, sandbars migrate. An aerial photograph from one summer can be misleading in the next. The North also contains long intervals where nothing new enters the file. A missing person investigation can remain open while active search operations end. Families keep watching routes and shorelines. Pilots and hunters report sightings years later that cannot be confirmed. Some searches become linked to later work, such as training exercises or renewed interest when conditions change. Kasara has publicly described involvement in northern searches that connect to older missing aircraft cases, emphasizing that the passage of time changes both the difficulty and the methods used. A winter with less snow cover can expose debris that was hidden for decades. A fire season can clear brush and reveal old impact marks. Those changes are not predictable on a schedule that matches an investigation. Search teams are trained to be systematic, and their documentation can be exact. What prevents a solved disappearance is often not a lack of effort, but a lack of durable evidence. The North is quiet and spacious, but it is not static. Snow loads and releases. Ice forms pressure ridges and then breaks into pans. Wind scours exposed slopes. Animals move and scatter small items. Time acts as a tool that the landscape uses, not as a neutral backdrop. In that setting, many searches end with a mapped record of where people looked and what conditions allowed them to see, rather than with a final, physical explanation, a signal that never arrives. In northern travel, communication is treated as a practical tool rather than a safety abstraction. Hunters, pilots, and seasonal workers carry devices because distances are large and schedules are flexible. The absence of a message often carries more weight than its content. Search coordination begins by determining whether a signal should exist at all, and if so, what kind. This determination shapes the first hours more than any terrain model or weather forecast. Emergency locator transmitters in aircraft have been required in Canada for decades, though their specifications have changed. Older 121.5 MHz beacons depended on aircraft antennas and line-of-sight reception. Since 2009, satellite monitoring shifted toward 406 MHz beacons registered to specific aircraft or owners. When activated, these units transmit digital identifiers routed through the COSPA SARSAT system to national mission control centers. In Canada, the Canadian Mission Control Centre forwards alerts to the appropriate Joint Rescue Coordination Centre. When a 406 beacon activates cleanly, its location estimate improves with each satellite pass. Silence can have several explanations, and coordinators move through them methodically. A beacon may not activate during an impact if the deceleration threshold is not reached, or if the antenna is damaged. In cold conditions, batteries lose capacity, reducing transmission strength or duration. Some aircraft are found years later with intact beacons that never triggered because the crash sequence did not meet activation criteria. In those cases, the absence of a signal does not narrow the search area. it leaves it unchanged. Personal locator beacons and satellite messengers add another layer. Many northern travelers carry devices that allow routine check-ins or tracking points. These are not standardized across manufacturers. Some log points only when a button is pressed. Others record intermittently when movement is detected. Search teams review account records to see the last successful transmission, the device settings, and whether the user was consistent in past use. A final point on a map can be precise without being reliable. It shows where a signal was sent, not where travel continued. Cellular coverage in the Great White North is limited and uneven. Along certain highways and near communities, towers provide service. Beyond those areas, phones switch to emergency mode or show no connection at all. When a phone briefly connects, it may register a location ping or send a partial message. Investigators can request records from service providers, but the data is often sparse. A single connection can indicate proximity to infrastructure rather than intent to stop. In practice, phone data is used to confirm presence near known corridors, not to define new ones. Aviation radio traffic offers another potential trail. Pilots flying visually in the north may not file formal flight plans, but they often use common frequencies to announce positions near airstrips, rivers, or passes. In some cases, a final transmission is remembered by another pilot hours later and reported after a search has begun. These recollections are valuable but imprecise. Radio calls are not recorded uniformly, and memory tends to place an aircraft closer to familiar landmarks than it may have been. Search coordinators note the report and widen the probable area rather than narrowing it. When no signal appears, search teams rely on expectation rather than confirmation. They ask whether the person was known to carry a device, whether it was charged, and whether it was usually turned on. Families often provide this information, along with patterns of behavior. A hunter may routinely turn off a tracker to save battery and reactivate it at camp. A pilot may disable an emergency transmitter during maintenance and forget to rearm it. These details are logged without judgment. They become part of the working record. The absence of communication also affects timing. In many northern communities, delayed returns are common and not immediately alarming. Weather changes plans, ice conditions force detours, mechanical problems are fixed on the land. This normal delay can push the start of a search back by a day or more. By the time silence is recognized as a problem, the opportunity for easy detection may have passed. Snowfall, wind, or river movement can occur in that interval without notice. Search organizations document these delays carefully. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which often leads missing person investigations in the territories, records when a person was last seen, when concern was raised, and when resources were requested. Joint Rescue Coordination Centers record when they were notified and what assets were tasked. The gap between these timestamps is not treated as an error, it is treated as context. In the North, context explains why communication failures matter even when equipment exists. In some cases, a signal arrives late. Beacons trapped under snow or ice can transmit intermittently as conditions change. Satellite messengers may reconnect after days without coverage. These delayed signals can create brief surges of activity, with aircraft redirected and ground teams repositioned. When the signal stops again, teams must decide whether it represented movement, exposure, or equipment behavior. Without additional confirmation, the signal is noted and the search pattern adjusted cautiously. There are documented cases where aircraft were later found within previously searched areas, despite no signals and no sightings. Investigations into these cases often show that detection conditions were poor at the time of the search. Low sun angles, uniform snow cover, and shadow patterns can hide wreckage even from trained observers. Communication data does not change this limitation. It only informs where to look first. Communication systems in the North are robust in design, but fragile in use. They depend on power, orientation, and human interaction. Search teams treat missing signals as neutral data rather than as indicators of failure or intent. A quiet device is recorded the same way as a broken one. It does not speak to outcome. It only defines the absence of guidance. As the search continues, the communication record becomes static. Logs show no new pings, no further transmissions, and no additional reports. At that point, teams transition fully to terrain-based probability and visual effort. The silence remains in the file, unchanged. It is not resolved by time. It is simply carried forward as part of the case. The distance between search lines. Search areas in the North are defined by geometry before they are defined by movement. Once an initial area is established, coordinators convert uncertainty into grids, tracks, or corridors. These shapes are drawn using standardized methods taught across Canadian search and rescue agencies. The intent is to distribute effort evenly across space, while accounting for terrain, visibility, and the type of target being sought. On paper, the result is orderly. In practice, the distance between search lines governs what can and cannot be detected. Aerial searches often use parallel track patterns. An aircraft flies a straight line, turns at a set interval, and flies back along a parallel line. The spacing between these lines is determined by expected visibility, known as sweep width. Sweep width is an estimate of how far to either side an observer can reliably detect the object of interest. It varies with altitude, speed, weather, background, contrast, and observer experience. In northern regions, sweep widths are often reduced because contrast is low and lighting is variable. Low sun angles are a persistent factor. In winter and shoulder seasons, the sun remains near the horizon for much of the day. This creates long shadows that change direction quickly. An object visible from one angle may disappear entirely from another. Search planners account for this by adjusting track orientation relative to the sun, but the adjustment cannot remove the effect. It can only shift it. As a result, detection probability fluctuates, even when coverage appears complete. Ground searches face a different spacing problem. Teams move along linear features such as rivers, ridges, shorelines, and established trails. These features concentrate travel, and therefore probability. Between them lie areas that are harder to enter and harder to observe. When teams move cross-country, they maintain visual contact with adjacent searches to ensure overlap. In tundra, this overlap may be wide. In forest or broken terrain, it narrows. A gap of a few meters can be enough to miss a person or object that blends with the background. Search planners calculate probability of detection rather than certainty. Each pass over an area increases the chance of seeing the target, but does not guarantee it. Canadian SAR doctrine emphasizes coverage rather than exhaustive inspection. This approach recognizes that resources are finite and conditions change. In the north, repeating a search under identical conditions is rarely useful. Snowfall, wind, and light alter the environment continuously, so a second pass is effectively a different search, even if it follows the same lines. Water searches introduce spacing challenges that are less visible. Rivers and coastal waters move objects in ways that are difficult to model precisely. A shoreline search may be spaced tightly, yet the object of interest may be submerged, buried in silt, or carried beyond the searched section. In tidal areas, timing matters as much as spacing. A search conducted at low tide may reveal debris that is invisible hours later. Planners schedule searches to match these cycles, but they cannot search continuously. Aircraft speed affects spacing indirectly. Faster speeds allow larger areas to be covered but reduce observer dwell time. Slower speeds increase dwell time but limit range. In the north, range often takes precedence because distances are large and fuel stops are few. This trade-off is documented in search planning notes, where coordinators balance area size against detection probability. The resulting spacing reflects compromise rather than optimization. Volunteer aircrews add capacity but also variability. Cassera spotters are trained to standard levels, yet individual perception differs. Fatigue sets in during long sorties, especially in cold and vibration. Search lines remain evenly spaced, but attention does not. Coordinators account for this by limiting sortie duration and rotating crews. Even so, the human element introduces unevenness that cannot be mapped. On the ground, spacing decisions are constrained by safety. Crevasses, thin ice, muskeg, and avalanche terrain limit where teams can move. Areas that cannot be entered are sometimes searched visually from a distance or left unsearched until conditions improve. In case files, these gaps persist as shaded areas with notes rather than coordinates. The concept of negative results is central. When a search line passes without detection, it reduces the probability that the target is within the effective sweep width of that line at that time. It does not eliminate the possibility. Search managers track these reductions mathematically. Over time, areas with lower residual probability may receive fewer resources, while areas with persistent uncertainty remain prioritized. This process is iterative and quiet, driven by tables and maps rather than narrative. Spacing also interacts with target size. A downed aircraft presents a larger visual signature than a single person. Clothing color, reflectivity, and movement affect detectability. In northern environments, many items share similar colors. A dark parka on rock A canoe hull against water or aluminum wreckage on gravel may not contrast enough to be noticed at planned spacing. Planners sometimes adjust spacing when target characteristics are known, but such details are often unavailable early in a search. Historical cases illustrate these limits without drawing conclusions. In several northern aircraft disappearances, later resolved by chance discovery, wreckage was found within areas previously flown. Investigations noted that conditions at the time of the original search reduced visibility. In some instances, subsequent environmental change exposed debris. These findings are recorded in after-action reports as lessons about spacing and conditions, rather than as critiques of effort. Technology has altered spacing decisions, but not eliminated them. High-resolution sensors, side-looking airborne radar, and infrared imaging are used selectively. Infrared performance depends on temperature differentials, which can be minimal in cold environments. Radar may detect shapes but requires interpretation and follow-up. These tools can justify wider spacing in some contexts, but they introduce their own uncertainties and false positives. Search planners document every adjustment, track spacing changes, aborted lines due to weather, and areas not covered are logged with timestamps. This record allows later review and, if necessary, renewed searching under different conditions. The documentation does not aim to tell a story. It preserves a sequence of decisions made with the information available at the time. As days pass, spacing decisions become more conservative. Fatigue, weather, and diminishing returns influence how lines are set. The area may remain large, but the effective search shrinks to places where visibility is highest or access is safest. This is not a conclusion about outcome. It is a reflection of how distance between lines governs effort when certainty cannot be achieved, where the land refuses to keep traces. In northern environments, physical traces are temporary. The land does not preserve marks for long, and it does not do so evenly. Snow, ice, water, vegetation, and soil interact continuously, altering surfaces in ways that are predictable in principle, but difficult to time precisely. For search teams, this means that evidence can disappear without notice, not through destruction but through ordinary environmental processes. Snow is the most obvious factor. Fresh snowfall can cover footprints, sled tracks, and disturbed ground within hours. Even light snow can soften edges enough to make direction and age difficult to determine. Wind compounds this effect. Drifting redistributes snow across open areas, filling depressions and exposing ridges. Tracks may remain visible in sheltered areas while vanishing completely in exposed ones. Search teams document snowfall amounts and wind conditions because these details affect how much weight to give to negative findings. Temperature changes alter snow structure. In very cold conditions, snow remains dry and granular, holding impressions briefly but breaking apart easily under wind. During warming periods, snow becomes cohesive, allowing tracks to hold shape longer but also enabling surface melt. When melt occurs, water refreezes overnight, sealing over previous disturbances. A footprint may be present beneath a crust that appears undisturbed from above. Ground teams learn to probe carefully, but probing is selective and cannot cover large areas. Ice behaves differently depending on thickness and season. Early winter ice may flex under weight, creating stress cracks that later freeze smooth. Spring ice breaks into plates that move and rejoin. On rivers and sea ice, pressure ridges form and collapse. Objects trapped beneath ice can shift position without surfacing. Searchers walking or flying over ice may see no sign of what lies below, even when it is close to the surface. Water obscures evidence in quieter ways. Rivers in the north often carry heavy sediment loads during melt. Objects entering the water can be quickly covered by silt. Visibility from the air is limited by surface glare, turbidity, and depth. Shorelines change shape with water level. A sandbar present one week may be submerged the next. When teams search shorelines, they note water height and flow rate, knowing that these values will not remain stable. Vegetation also plays a role. In tundra regions, low plants can spring back after being walked on, especially when moist. In forested areas, leaf litter and fallen needles mask disturbance. In summer, growth can be rapid, covering ground that was bare weeks earlier. A disturbed patch may blend back into its surroundings before it is ever observed. These changes occur gradually and leave no clear boundary between altered and unaltered ground. Animals contribute to trace loss without intention. Caribou, moose, and smaller animals cross human tracks, breaking edges and adding noise. Scavengers move small items. Birds pick at fabric or reflective material. None of this activity indicates time or direction in a way that can be reliably reconstructed. Search teams note animal presence but treat its effects as background rather than as evidence. The passage of time changes the meaning of absence. In the first day or two, a lack of tracks near a known route may suggest the person stayed on course. After several days, the same lack of tracks may reflect environmental erasure. Search planners adjust assumptions accordingly, but these adjustments are probabilistic rather than definitive. They do not resolve uncertainty, they only reframe it. Soil conditions vary widely across the north. Permafrost limits how deeply impressions can form. In some areas, a thin, active layer thaws seasonally, creating mud that records tracks briefly before refreezing. In others, gravel and rock leave little impression at all. A person traveling across bedrock leaves almost no trace. Aircraft wreckage on rocky terrain may scatter fragments that resemble natural debris. Fire alters landscapes abruptly. Wildfires remove vegetation, expose soil, and change surface contrast. After a fire, areas previously difficult to search may become visible from the air. Conversely, ash and char can obscure metallic objects and alter magnetic readings. Fire seasons do not align with search timelines. When fire reveals debris, it often does so years later, outside the context of an active operation. Search documentation reflects these realities. Ground teams record substrate types and conditions encountered. A report may note no tracks observed, alongside descriptions of snow depth, wind, and temperature. These qualifiers are essential. Without them, absence could be misinterpreted as information rather than as a condition-dependent observation. The north also lacks fixed reference points. Trails shift with use and disuse. River crossings change. Seasonal routes appear and disappear. A track leading into an area may not correspond to a permanent path. When teams attempt to follow routes, they rely on local knowledge and historical patterns rather than on maps alone. Even then, the land may not reflect those patterns at the time of the search. Aerial observation is subject to the same limitations. Shadows, glare, and uniform textures reduce contrast. Fresh snow creates a blank surface that hides everything beneath it. Older snow develops wind patterns that mimic linear features. Observers are trained to recognize these effects, but training cannot overcome physics. A hidden object remains hidden until conditions change. Search teams sometimes return to areas after environmental shifts. A thaw may expose ground. A drought may lower water levels. A freeze may stabilize ice enough to allow travel. These returns are based on opportunity rather than expectation. The land does not signal when it is ready to reveal something. Teams monitor conditions and act when access improves. In official records, unresolved cases often include notes about trace persistence. Investigators acknowledge that evidence may no longer exist in recoverable form. This is not treated as a failure of the search, but as a property of the environment. The north does not accumulate layers of disturbance the way urban spaces do. It resets itself continuously. For families and communities, this characteristic can be difficult to reconcile with the effort expended. From a procedural perspective, however, it explains why thorough searches sometimes yield nothing tangible. The land has already done its ordinary work. Snow has fallen, water has moved, vegetation has grown, animals have passed through. These processes do not mark their progress in ways that can be reversed. As time extends, searchers rely less on trace following and more on area coverage and probability. The absence of tracks becomes expected rather than surprising. Teams continue to log conditions, knowing that future searchers will interpret those logs differently as circumstances change. The record remains factual and incomplete by design. When time outpaces the search, time enters northern search operations as a constraint rather than a narrative element. From the moment a search begins, coordinators record hours and days because elapsed time changes what actions are practical. It does not change what is known, it changes what can still be done. As days pass, the difference between initial response and sustained effort becomes more pronounced, especially in remote regions. In the first phase, resources are mobilized rapidly, aircraft are tasked, ground teams assembled, and command posts established. This phase is time-sensitive because detection probability is highest when environmental conditions are closest to those present at the moment of disappearance. Equipment batteries, if present, are more likely to function. Human endurance, if survival is possible, has not yet been exceeded. Search planners emphasize speed during this period without assuming outcome. As operations extend beyond the first days, logistical realities assert themselves. Aircraft hours are limited by maintenance schedules and crew availability. Weather windows close and reopen irregularly. Fuel caches may need to be repositioned or replenished. Ground teams rotate to manage fatigue. Each rotation introduces new personnel who must be briefed and oriented, increasing administrative load without increasing coverage. This shift is recorded internally as a transition from response to sustainment. Jurisdictional coordination also changes with time. In Canada's northern regions, missing person investigations often remain under police authority, even when federal search and rescue assets are involved. As days pass without findings, the balance of coordination may tilt toward investigation rather than search. This does not mean searching stops immediately. It means that decisions are reviewed more frequently and taskings are justified against diminishing probabilities. Weather accumulates as a factor rather than a single event. A storm that grounds aircraft for one day may not end a search. Repeated weather delays, however, fragment coverage. Search lines flown under one set of conditions may not be revisited under improved ones because resources have shifted elsewhere. The record shows what was searched and when. It does not guarantee that optimal conditions ever occurred over the entire area. Community involvement changes over time as well. In the early stages, local volunteers often participate actively, providing transport, guidance, and observation. As weeks pass, daily responsibilities resume. Participation becomes intermittent. This does not reflect reduced concern. It reflects practical limits. Search coordinators note when volunteer availability declines because it affects ground coverage and local reporting. Time also affects information flow. Early in a case, reports arrive quickly. Sightings, sounds, and observations are logged and evaluated. As time passes, new reports often refer to older events or second-hand information. These are still recorded, but treated differently. Investigators distinguish between contemporaneous observations and retrospective ones because memory changes with time. This distinction affects how reports influence search decisions. Funding structures influence duration. Federal search and rescue operations are publicly funded, but they operate within planning frameworks that prioritize active survivability and recent incidents. As elapsed time increases, justification shifts toward recovery rather than rescue. This shift is procedural. It does not require a conclusion about what happened. It reflects how agencies allocate limited assets across concurrent demands. Documentation expands as activity contracts. When searches are active, records focus on tasking and execution. When activity slows, reports become more detailed. Search managers compile summaries of areas covered, conditions encountered, and resources used. They are written in neutral language, avoiding inference beyond observable facts. The concept of suspension emerges gradually. Searches are not typically called off in a single decision. They are scaled back. Aircraft are released first, followed by organized ground teams. Monitoring continues through passive means such as community reports and incidental sightings. Official language often states that active searching has been suspended pending new information. This phrasing reflects administrative status rather than closure. Time affects evidence handling as well. Items recovered early can be examined promptly. Items found later may be degraded by exposure. Fabric frays, metal corrodes, plastics become brittle. Investigators document condition carefully because degradation complicates interpretation. The absence of recoverable evidence is noted without extrapolation. In prolonged cases, search files remain open. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police maintains records that can be revisited years later. Joint Rescue Coordination Centres retain logs of taskings and alerts. These records do not expire quickly. They serve as reference points if new information emerges. The existence of a file does not imply ongoing activity. It preserves continuity. Elapsed time also affects technology. New tools may become available years after a disappearance. Improved satellite imagery, changes in sensor resolution, or expanded coverage can prompt renewed analysis of old areas. When this occurs, planners compare past conditions with present capabilities. They do not reinterpret earlier decisions as errors. Families often experience time differently from institutions. From an operational perspective, time measures feasibility. From a personal perspective, it measures absence. Search agencies acknowledge this difference without addressing it directly in planning documents. Communication with families focuses on what has been done and what can still be done, expressed in concrete terms. Searches in the north sometimes resume after long intervals due to environmental change. A drought lowers water levels. A retreating glacier exposes ground. A wildfire clears vegetation. These events are not predictable and do not align with investigative timelines. When they occur, agencies review old files to determine whether conditions now allow access that was previously impossible. Time does not resolve uncertainty. It alters the shape of effort. Early searches are broad and urgent. Later efforts are narrow and conditional. At no point does time alone provide information about outcome. It only reduces the range of actions available. Operationally, this reality is accepted. Search managers are trained to work within it. They document decisions knowing they may be read long after circumstances have changed. The file becomes a stable object in an unstable environment. As days extend into months, the search transforms into a state of readiness rather than activity. Resources remain identifiable. Contacts remain current. Conditions are monitored. The absence of movement becomes normal within the system. This normalization does not indicate resolution. It reflects how time outpaces the search without answering the question that initiated it. The limits of maps and models. Modern search operations rely heavily on mapping systems and probability models to organize effort. These tools are designed to impose structure on uncertainty by converting known information into visual and numerical form. In northern searches, they are indispensable. They are also constrained by assumptions that do not always hold in remote and changing environments. Mapping begins with base data. Topographic maps, satellite imagery, hydrographic charts, and land-cover datasets provide the foundation. In much of the Great White North, these sources vary in age and resolution. Some areas are mapped in detail, especially near communities, airstrips, and transportation corridors. Others rely on older surveys or generalized data. Elevation contours may be coarse. Watercourses may have shifted since the last update. Seasonal features such as ice roads or winter trails are often absent entirely. Search planners layer information onto these bases. Last known position, intended route, travel method, and environmental conditions are entered into geographic information systems. Software then generates probable movement zones based on terrain, slope, vegetation, and known human behavior patterns. These zones are not predictions. They are weighted areas where effort may be more efficient. The distinction matters operationally. Teams are instructed to treat models as guides rather than answers. Probability of area calculations are central to this process. Planners estimate where a person or object is most likely to be. Given available information, these estimates are updated as searches proceed and areas are cleared. The math is sound within its parameters. The challenge arises when parameters are incomplete or inaccurate. In the north, incompleteness is common. Human movement models often assume continuous travel along least cost paths. These paths are calculated using slope, surface type, and known obstacles. In practice, northern travel does not always follow such logic. Hunters detour for game. Pilots divert around weather systems that are not reflected in surface models. Snow machine routes follow ice conditions rather than terrain efficiency. When real movement deviates from modeled assumptions, probability zones can misalign with reality without producing obvious errors. Environmental models introduce further limits. Wind and water drift models are used when objects may have moved after an incident. These models depend on historical averages and real-time data. In northern regions, weather stations are sparse. River gauges are limited. Sea ice movement is influenced by local winds, currents, and pressure ridges that are difficult to capture at fine scale. As a result, drift predictions widen quickly, producing large areas of low-confidence probability rather than focused search zones. Maps also struggle with vertical complexity. Canyons, cutbanks, and variable snow depth affect visibility and access in ways that two-dimensional representations cannot show. An area marked as searched on a map may include sections that were never visible from the air due to shadow or terrain masking. Planners annotate these limitations, but the map itself remains a simplified surface. Search software allows planners to simulate coverage. Track lines flown by aircraft are overlaid on maps, and effective sweep widths are applied to estimate detection probability. These calculations assume uniform observer performance and consistent conditions along each line. In reality, conditions change continuously along a sortie. Cloud cover, glare, turbulence, and fatigue vary within minutes. The model averages these factors. It does not record their fluctuations. Historical data informs many models. Past cases are used to estimate how far people travel over time, how they respond to terrain, and where they are eventually found. In southern or temperate regions, these datasets are relatively large. In the north, case numbers are smaller and more heterogeneous. Applying generalized statistics to unique circumstances introduces uncertainty that cannot be resolved by additional computation. Mapping tools also depend on accurate inputs. Last known position is often estimated rather than measured. A person may have been seen near a river hours before departure. A pilot may have departed without radar coverage. These approximations are entered into systems with confidence ranges, but the underlying uncertainty remains. When the starting point is vague, the resulting model expands rapidly. Technological advances have improved base imagery. High-resolution satellite images and, in some areas, airborne LiDAR provide detailed views of terrain. These datasets enhance planning by revealing obstacles and access routes. They do not guarantee detection. Imagery is static, capturing a moment that may not correspond to current conditions. Snow cover, vegetation growth, and water levels can differ significantly between image capture and search execution. Maps also influence decision-making indirectly. Visual representations can create a sense of completeness when coverage appears dense. Even experienced planners are aware of this effect and caution against it. A fully shaded map does not mean an area was fully observable. It means it was assigned effort under certain conditions. The difference is documented in notes rather than visible in the primary display. In northern searches, local knowledge often supplements or contradicts mapped assumptions. Community members may identify travel corridors that are not marked on official maps. These routes may exist only seasonally or be known only through use. Planners incorporate this information by adding custom layers or annotations. The map becomes a hybrid object, combining formal data with informal input. Its accuracy depends on continued communication. Models are also limited by time sensitivity. Probability calculations are most informative early, when uncertainty is lower and conditions are closer to the moment of disappearance. As time passes, environmental change increases divergence between modeled scenarios and reality. Planners adjust by broadening search areas or shifting emphasis to accessibility rather than probability. The model remains present but less directive. Search managers are trained to recognize model limitations explicitly. Canadian SAR doctrine emphasizes that models support but do not replace judgment. After-action reports often note where model outputs were helpful and where they were not. These notes feed back into training rather than into algorithmic change alone. Human interpretation remains central. There are cases where models suggest areas that are never searched due to access constraints. Steep terrain, unstable ice, or hazardous weather may render high-probability zones unreachable. These zones are documented as unsearched. The model does not resolve this conflict. It records it. The presence of an unsearched high-probability area remains an open variable in the case file. Conversely, areas with low modeled probability may receive effort because they are accessible or because incidental information points there. This does not invalidate the model. It reflects operational pragmatism. Maps and models describe one dimension of reality. Operations must accommodate others. Over time, the accumulation of modeled outputs becomes part of the case record. Maps show evolving probability surfaces, coverage overlays, and decision points. They allow later reviewers to see how understanding changed. They do not provide answers on their own. They preserve process rather than outcome. In the north, the environment resists reduction to static representation. Rivers shift, ice moves, and snow reshapes surfaces faster than maps can be updated. Models attempt to account for this through uncertainty margins, but margins grow as conditions diverge. At a certain point, the model's primary function is organizational rather than predictive. Search teams continue to use maps and models because they provide a common reference. They allow coordination across agencies and time. Their limits are acknowledged in training and practice. They are tools suited to managing effort, not to resolving disappearance. As cases persist without resolution, maps remain in the file as layered records of action. They show where people looked, under what assumptions, and with what tools. They do not explain what happened. They document how the search adapted to the limits of representation. When searches end without answers, the conclusion of an active search is an administrative state rather than an event. In northern cases, it is reached through a series of decisions that narrow activity without resolving uncertainty. These decisions are documented carefully because they define what has been done, not what has been determined. Ending a search does not alter the status of a disappearance. It changes how agencies allocate resources going forward. In Canada, the authority to scale back or suspend search operations depends on jurisdiction and context. Joint Rescue Coordination Centers manage federal air and maritime search assets, while police agencies, most often the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in the north, retain responsibility for missing person investigations. When active searching reaches a point where further tasking is unlikely to increase detection probability, coordination shifts from operational deployment to case maintenance. Search managers assess several practical factors. Coverage already completed is reviewed against conditions at the time it occurred. Weather windows, visibility, and access constraints are considered alongside resource use. This assessment does not involve predicting outcome. It evaluates whether repeating or expanding effort would materially change what can be observed. When the answer is consistently negative, activity is reduced. The language used in official statements reflects this restraint. Agencies typically state that active searching has been suspended pending new information. This phrasing is deliberate. It avoids implication of finality. It acknowledges that the search can be reactivated if conditions change or if credible information emerges. Suspension is not closure. It is a pause without a defined end date. Before suspension, records are consolidated. Flight logs, ground team reports, maps, and communication transcripts are assembled into a single file. Areas searched are marked with dates and conditions. Areas not searched are noted with reasons such as weather, terrain, or safety. These distinctions are important for future reference. They preserve the operational context rather than simplifying it. Families are informed through established channels. Communication focuses on actions taken and current status. Agencies avoid speculation and do not provide interpretations beyond documented facts. In northern communities, this communication may involve local leadership or community liaisons familiar with regional practices. The intent is to convey clarity about process rather than explanation of outcome. Once active searching ends, responsibility often shifts fully to investigative units. The RCMP maintains missing person files that remain open indefinitely unless resolved. These files include search documentation but also extend beyond it, incorporating interviews, background information, and any subsequent reports. The investigative phase may continue quietly without visible activity. Monitoring replaces searching. Communities are asked to report sightings or discoveries. Pilots, hunters, and travelers are informed of the missing case through bulletins or informal networks. This passive monitoring does not consume dedicated resources but allows new information to enter the system. Reports received months or years later are evaluated against the existing record. The distinction between rescue and recovery becomes procedural rather than declarative. In early phases, operations are often framed as rescue because survivability cannot be excluded. As time passes, the operational focus shifts toward recovery, even if the term is not emphasized publicly. This shift affects asset selection and tasking, but does not require a formal determination about survival. Environmental conditions influence decisions about when to revisit an area. Search agencies track seasonal changes that may expose ground or lower water levels. These opportunities are noted in files, but are not always acted upon immediately. Action depends on access, safety, and competing demands. The absence of immediate action does not indicate dismissal. It reflects prioritization. Funding and resource availability also shape conclusions. Search and rescue assets serve multiple regions and incidents. Prolonged commitment to one unresolved case limits responsiveness elsewhere. Managers document this constraint explicitly. Decisions to end active searching are framed as resource management choices rather than judgments about likelihood or outcome. Historical precedent informs these decisions. After-action reports from prior northern searches show similar patterns of scaling back. These reports emphasize lessons about timing, access, and conditions. They rarely address outcome directly. The institutional focus remains on improving future response rather than resolving past uncertainty. In some cases, formal search operations end, while community searching continues independently. Family members and local residents may revisit areas during routine travel or seasonal activities. Agencies acknowledge this activity but do not direct it. Any findings are reported back through established channels and assessed within the existing case framework. Documentation standards ensure that cases can be reopened coherently. Maps retain their layers. Logs preserve timestamps. Decisions are recorded with rationale. This allows new personnel to understand prior actions without reinterpretation. It also allows future searches to avoid duplication or to target previously inaccessible areas. Technological change can prompt renewed review without physical searching. Improved satellite imagery, updated databases, or new analytical methods may be applied to old cases. When this occurs, agencies reference the original search record to contextualize findings. The presence of a detailed record enables reassessment without implying error in earlier work. Public attention does not determine search status. Media coverage may increase or decline independently of operational decisions. Agencies maintain their internal criteria, regardless of visibility. In northern cases, many suspensions occur without broad public awareness. The absence of attention does not correlate with effort expended. The status of unresolved cases remains unchanged after suspension. Individuals are still listed as missing. Files remain active in administrative terms. The conclusion of a search does not produce a new category or designation. It preserves the original uncertainty within a stable procedural frame. Over time, unresolved searches become part of institutional memory. Training materials reference them as examples of environmental and logistical limits. These references focus on process rather than narrative. They illustrate how searches can be thorough without being conclusive. In official language, there is no moment when a search is said to have failed. There is only a point at which active searching is no longer justified by available information and conditions. This distinction is maintained consistently across northern operations. The absence of answers is recorded as an outcome without interpretation. Case files reflect effort, not resolution. They remain available for review as long as records are retained. The conclusion of active searching marks the end of one phase of response, not the end of the case itself. What remains in the record? After an active search is suspended, the disappearance enters a different operational phase, defined by documentation rather than movement. The record becomes the primary location of the case. It is not a summary of conclusions, because none have been reached. It is a fixed collection of actions, observations, and decisions preserved, so that the case does not depend on memory or continuity of personnel. Every northern search produces multiple streams of documentation. Flight plans, sortie logs, radio transcripts, and weather briefings are generated during operations. These materials are time-stamped and stored in standardized formats. They establish what assets were used, where they went, and under what conditions. Once active searching ends, these operational files are no longer updated, but they are not discarded. They remain retrievable as static references. Alongside operational logs are planning artifacts, probability maps, search grids, and tasking schedules show how effort was distributed. These documents capture intent rather than result. They show why certain areas were prioritized and others deferred. In unresolved cases, these materials are retained specifically to prevent later reinterpretation. They preserve the logic of decisions as it existed at the time. Police records form another layer. In northern regions, missing person investigations are typically maintained by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. These files include personal identifiers, last known activities, interview notes, and summaries of search actions. Unlike operational search files, police records remain active indefinitely. Their status does not change when searching stops. The case remains classified as missing unless resolved by identification or discovery. The structure of these records emphasizes chronology. Entries are added as events occur, not rearranged later. Early entries tend to be frequent and detailed, reflecting rapid information flow. Later entries may be separated by months or years. This spacing is not interpreted within the file. It simply reflects when information was available. Silence is represented by the absence of new entries rather than by commentary. Environmental context is embedded throughout the record. Weather conditions, ice state, daylight hours, and terrain descriptions appear repeatedly in reports. These details are not peripheral. They define the limits of observation. When future reviewers encounter statements such as no findings, the surrounding environmental notes explain what that statement could realistically mean under those conditions. Recovered items are documented with particular care. Even when ownership cannot be confirmed, objects are logged with precise location, description, and condition. Storage decisions are recorded, including transfers between agencies or facilities. This process ensures that any later reassessment has access to original material rather than recollection. In cases where no items are recovered, the record reflects this absence without elaboration. There is no attempt to explain why nothing was found. The documentation remains descriptive rather than interpretive. This restraint is deliberate. It prevents later readers from inferring causation from lack of evidence. National registries provide a condensed version of the case. These databases include identifying information, date of disappearance, and general location. They are designed for matching rather than narrative. When remains are found elsewhere, registry comparisons may link them to older cases. The detailed search record is then consulted to contextualize the discovery. Until such a link occurs, the registry entry remains unchanged. Records are also shaped by legal standards. Documentation must be sufficient to withstand review, whether internal or external. This requirement influences how language is used. Reports avoid speculation and limit statements to observable facts. Quotations are attributed, assumptions are labeled as such, or omitted entirely. The resulting tone is uniform across cases, regardless of circumstance. Over time, records may be accessed for reasons unrelated to resolution. Training programs use anonymized extracts to illustrate operational constraints. Policy reviews examine files to assess compliance with procedures. These uses do not alter the record, they rely on its stability. The record's value lies in its consistency rather than its completeness. Public access introduces another dimension. Portions of records may be released through formal information requests. When this occurs, agencies redact personal and sensitive information but do not revise content. The released material reflects the state of knowledge at the time entries were made. Gaps are not filled, ambiguities remain visible. Families sometimes engage with the record indirectly. When updates are requested, agencies summarize documented actions rather than reinterpret events. This practice ensures that communication remains aligned with the official file. The record functions as a boundary, limiting how much can be said without introducing inference. Technological changes affect record storage but not content. Paper files are digitized. Map layers are converted to new formats. Audio recordings are transferred to updated media. Each conversion is logged to maintain integrity. Original versions are preserved when possible. These processes ensure longevity without altering meaning. Records also persist across jurisdictional boundaries. When information is shared with neighboring regions or federal partners, summaries are exchanged rather than full files. Each agency maintains its own primary record. Cross-references note when information was shared and with whom. This structure allows coordination without merging distinct documentation systems. In unresolved cases, the record accumulates a particular quality. It becomes less about action and more about readiness. Contact lists are kept current. Locations of stored materials are noted. Conditions that might warrant renewed searching are sometimes flagged without scheduling action. The file remains prepared for change without anticipating it. The record does not evolve into a narrative over time. It does not move toward closure. It remains segmented, with each entry anchored to its date and context. This structure resists retrospective interpretation. It ensures that later developments, if they occur, are added rather than woven backward. Silence occupies space in the record without explanation. Months or years without entries are not annotated. This absence is intentional. It reflects the reality that nothing new entered the system. The record does not compensate for this absence by speculation. When a case is revisited after long intervals, the existing record provides orientation. New personnel can see what was done, what conditions existed, and where uncertainty remains. They do not need to reconstruct the past. They can build on it without altering it. The persistence of the record serves an institutional function. It ensures accountability for past decisions and continuity for future ones. It also ensures that unresolved disappearances are not erased by administrative closure. The file remains present, even when activity does not. What remains in the record is therefore a structured absence. It documents effort without outcome, context without conclusion. In northern searches, this form of preservation is not an exception. It is the expected state when the land and time do not yield recoverable answers. How communities carry the missing. In northern regions, the conclusion of formal search activity does not remove a disappearance from daily awareness. Communities continue to hold practical knowledge about who is missing, where they were last seen, and how they moved through the land. This knowledge is not stored in files or databases. It is carried through routine activities, conversations, and seasonal travel, forming an informal system that operates alongside official records without replacing them. Small populations make absence noticeable. In many northern communities, travel patterns are familiar. People know who hunts which areas, who flies which routes, and who travels alone. When someone does not return, that absence remains visible long after agencies scale back operations. This visibility does not rely on reminders. It is embedded in shared routines, such as unused cabins, unattended equipment, or routes no longer traveled by a particular person. Community awareness often takes practical forms. Hunters and travelers watch for equipment, clothing, or signs while moving through areas connected to the disappearance. Pilots flying routine supply runs scan shorelines and river bends without formal tasking. These observations are not coordinated centrally. They occur as part of normal movement across the land. When something unusual is seen, it is reported through established channels, often beginning with local authorities or community leaders. Informal reporting networks function without documentation until a report is made. Information may circulate verbally for some time before reaching agencies. This delay is not treated as a failure. It reflects how communities assess relevance before involving external systems. When a report is eventually passed on, agencies evaluate it against existing records and determine whether follow-up is warranted. Seasonal cycles influence this process. In winter, travel corridors shift onto frozen waterways and ice roads. In summer, boats and all-terrain vehicles open different routes. Each season exposes different parts of the landscape. Community members adjust their awareness accordingly, noting areas that were inaccessible during formal searches but become reachable later. These shifts are not scheduled. They occur as part of lived experience. Community knowledge also preserves context that may not appear in official files. Details about habitual detours, preferred campsites, or weather decisions are remembered locally even if they were never documented. When agencies revisit cases, this contextual information can supplement records. It is treated as additional input rather than as correction. Official files remain unchanged, but local detail can inform renewed effort. Cultural practices shape how missing individuals are spoken about. In some communities, names continue to be mentioned during planning or travel discussions. This practice maintains awareness without formal commemoration. It is not intended to draw conclusions. It keeps the person present in practical terms, reminding others to remain observant in certain areas. Local radio and bulletin boards sometimes serve as quiet carriers of information. Notices may be posted when remains or property are found, asking whether anyone recognizes them. These notices are factual and brief. They do not speculate. When recognition occurs, it is reported to authorities. When it does not, the notice may remain for some time before being removed without comment. Community search efforts occasionally occur independently of agencies. Families or local groups may revisit areas during routine travel. These activities are not coordinated as formal searches and do not follow standardized patterns. Agencies acknowledge their occurrence but do not direct them. Any findings are evaluated within the existing case framework. The absence of findings is not formally recorded unless reported. The relationship between communities and agencies is shaped by trust built over time. In northern regions, residents are accustomed to working with the RCMP, search and rescue volunteers, and other responders. Communication channels remain open after searches end. This continuity allows new information to enter the system without reopening formal operations prematurely. Community memory also persists through material traces. Equipment left in place, such as a cached fuel drum or an unused shelter, can serve as a reference point. These objects may be encountered years later and prompt renewed attention. When such items are reported, agencies cross-reference them with existing records to determine relevance. Education and training reinforce this informal role. Northern travelers are often taught to report unusual findings, even if they seem old or insignificant. This guidance emphasizes observation rather than interpretation. Communities understand that agencies prefer raw information over conclusions. This shared understanding supports accurate reporting. Media coverage interacts unevenly with community awareness. Some cases receive attention beyond the region. Others remain known only locally. Media interest does not determine whether a community continues to observe and report. Awareness persists regardless of external visibility. Communities do not require public attention to maintain memory. Time affects community engagement differently than it affects institutions. While agencies track elapsed time as a factor in feasibility, communities experience time through repetition of seasons and routes. Each return to a familiar place renews the possibility of noticing something previously unseen. This cyclical exposure contrasts with the linear progression of official case files. Community members sometimes act as intermediaries between families and agencies. Elders, local leaders, or experienced travelers may assist in communicating information or clarifying context. Their role is not formalized. It emerges from familiarity with both the land and institutional processes. Agencies recognize this role without codifying it. Informal observation does not produce closure. It maintains readiness. Communities understand that most days yield nothing new. This expectation does not diminish attention, it normalizes it. Watching becomes part of routine movement rather than a response to urgency. When discoveries occur, community involvement is evident in how information surfaces. A hunter may report an item to local police. A pilot may mention a sighting during a routine check-in. These reports enter official systems quietly. The community role is often visible only in the initial step. Community awareness also extends to neighboring regions. Travel routes cross jurisdictional boundaries. Information may be shared informally between communities before reaching agencies. This horizontal flow complements vertical reporting structures. Agencies account for this by noting sources and transmission paths in records. The continuation of awareness does not imply expectation of resolution. Communities carry missing individuals as part of shared experience rather than as open questions demanding answers. This stance aligns with operational reality. It acknowledges uncertainty without attempting to resolve it. In this way, communities provide a form of continuity that institutions cannot replicate. They observe without tasking, remember without files, and report without schedule. Their role does not replace formal systems. It supplements them by ensuring that absence remains visible in the places where it matters most. The connection between community awareness and official records remains intact through reporting and documentation. Information flows inward when relevant. Silence flows outward when nothing new is found. Both are accepted state. As long as people continue to move through northern landscapes, this informal system persists. It does not conclude cases or alter records. It maintains a practical attentiveness shaped by place, season, and shared experience. When remains are found years later, discoveries that occur long after a disappearance enter the system quietly. They do not reopen a search in the way initial reports do. Instead, they initiate a verification process designed to integrate new physical information into an existing record without altering prior actions. In northern regions, these discoveries often occur incidentally during routine travel, construction, or environmental change, rather than through directed searching. Remains are most commonly reported by individuals moving through remote areas for unrelated reasons. Hunters, hikers, pilots, survey crews, and seasonal workers encounter objects or material that appear out of place. Reports are typically made to local police, or in some cases, directly to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police detachment serving the area. The initial report focuses on location, appearance, and accessibility. Interpretation is avoided at this stage. Once a report is received, agencies assess whether the find requires immediate site control. In remote northern locations, access can be delayed by weather, distance, or lack of transportation. During these delays, reporting parties are often instructed not to disturb the site further. These instructions are procedural and standardized. Recovery operations differ from search operations. They are narrower in scope and focused on documentation rather than coverage. Personnel record the position of remains using available navigation tools, noting coordinate accuracy and environmental conditions. Photographs are taken to capture context, including surrounding terrain, vegetation, and any associated objects. The goal is to preserve spatial relationships rather than to reconstruct events. Environmental exposure affects remains in predictable but variable ways. Cold temperatures can slow decomposition, while freeze-thaw cycles fragment bone and clothing. Scavenging animals may scatter material over wide areas. Water exposure alters remains differently depending on current, temperature, and sediment. Investigators document these conditions carefully because they affect what can be determined later. They do not attempt to infer timelines beyond what forensic analysis can support. Associated property is catalogued alongside remains. Clothing, equipment, identification, and personal items are photographed, described, and packaged separately. Even when items appear degraded or incomplete, they are retained. In northern cases, clothing fragments or equipment components may be the primary link to an existing missing person file. Each item is logged with reference to its position relative to the remains. Transportation of remains follows established protocols. In remote regions, this may involve air transport to regional centers. Chain of custody documentation accompanies the transfer. These records ensure continuity from discovery through examination. Delays caused by weather or logistics are noted explicitly so that later analysis accounts for storage conditions and handling time. Forensic identification begins once remains reach appropriate facilities. Depending on condition, this may involve dental comparison, DNA analysis, or anthropological assessment. In some cases, identification is not immediately possible due to degradation or lack of comparative data. National databases are consulted to match biological profiles with missing person records. This process can take months or longer. When a potential match is identified, investigators compare details from the discovery with existing case files. Location, terrain, and recovered property are assessed against known information about the missing individual. This comparison does not revise earlier search conclusions. It contextualizes the discovery within what was known at the time. Discrepancies are documented rather than resolved through assumption. Notification of families occurs only after identification reaches required confidence thresholds. Agencies follow protocols designed to prevent premature conclusions. Communication focuses on confirmed facts, what was found, where, and how identification was established. Details beyond those facts may remain unavailable. Families are informed of investigative limitations as part of this process. Official case status changes only after identification is confirmed. A missing person case may then be reclassified as located, with notation that remains were recovered. This administrative change does not imply explanation of circumstances. Cause and manner of death, if determinable, are addressed separately through coroner or medical examiner processes. In some northern cases, these determinations remain undetermined due to environmental effect. The original search record is not rewritten following a discovery. Instead, new entries are appended. Notes describe the discovery, recovery, and identification steps, referencing the earlier search documentation for context. This preserves chronology and prevents retrospective reinterpretation of earlier decisions. The record reflects addition rather than correction. Delayed discoveries sometimes occur within areas previously searched. When this happens, agencies review search conditions at the time of earlier operations. Reports may note factors such as snow cover, water level, or visibility that would have limited detection. These notes are factual and do not assign fault. They serve to explain why the discovery did not contradict earlier negative findings. In other cases, remains are found outside previously defined search areas. This outcome prompts review of initial assumptions about movement and location. The review focuses on whether new information alters understanding of travel patterns. It does not change how the original search was conducted. The distinction between hindsight and decision-making under uncertainty is maintained explicitly. Environmental change often plays a role in delayed discovery. Retreating glaciers expose ground previously inaccessible. Lower water levels reveal shorelines. Wildfires clear vegetation. Permafrost thaw shifts soil and debris. Agencies document these factors as part of the discovery context. They recognize that timing of exposure is independent of search effort. Public communication following discovery is restrained. Statements typically confirm identification and location without detailing speculative causes. This approach aligns with earlier communication standards. It avoids creating narratives that exceed available evidence. Media interest varies, but agencies maintain consistency in factual presentation, regardless of attention level. Records from delayed discoveries contribute to institutional learning. After-action reviews may reference such cases to illustrate environmental effects on detectability. These references focus on process and conditions rather than outcomes. They reinforce understanding of northern operational limits without reframing unresolved aspects. Not all discoveries lead to identification. Some remains remain unidentified despite analysis. In these cases, files remain open under unidentified remains categories. Information is entered into national systems for potential future matching. The associated missing person cases remain unresolved. Documentation reflects linkage attempts without outcome. Time affects evidentiary interpretation. Materials recovered years later may lack contextual clarity. Degradation obscures cause, sequence, and timing. Investigators record these limits explicitly. The absence of determinations is treated as a factual result rather than an investigative failure. Community involvement often surfaces again during delayed discoveries. The reporting individual may be a community member familiar with the land. Agencies document how the discovery came to attention, including whether it resulted from routine travel or environmental change. This context becomes part of the appended record. Once identification is completed and records updated, active investigative steps may conclude. This transition is administrative. It does not answer broader questions about how or why the disappearance occurred. In northern operations, Delayed discovery is treated as a possible outcome rather than an exception. Systems are designed to absorb new information without destabilizing earlier work. The process emphasizes continuity, accuracy, and restraint. The integration of remains found years later demonstrates how uncertainty persists alongside resolution. Identification may occur without explanation. The record accommodates both states simultaneously. Why patterns rarely form. Efforts to understand northern disappearances often turn toward aggregation. When individual cases remain unresolved, analysts look for common elements that might clarify risk or guide prevention. In practice, this approach produces limited results. The diversity of circumstances, environments, and timelines in northern regions resists consolidation into stable patterns. At the institutional level, agencies maintain statistics on missing persons, search operations, and recoveries. These figures describe frequency, location, and broad outcomes. They are useful for resource planning and training. They are less useful for explanation. Northern cases span vast areas and long periods, with each incident shaped by specific conditions that do not repeat reliably. Geography complicates comparison. The Great White North includes Arctic coastlines, inland tundra, boreal forest, mountain ranges, river systems, and seasonal ice routes. Travel methods vary accordingly. A disappearance involving a small aircraft in the Yukon shares little operational similarity with a hunter overdue near Hudson Bay. Aggregating such cases produces categories that are too broad to inform detailed understanding. Temporal variation further reduces comparability. Some disappearances occur during short daylight periods in winter. Others happen under continuous summer light. Weather conditions differ not only seasonally but hourly. Snow, wind, temperature, and visibility change rapidly. When these variables are averaged across cases, their influence is diluted. The resulting pattern reflects abstraction rather than lived conditions. Human behavior does not standardize easily. Northern travel is often individualized, shaped by experience, purpose, and local knowledge. Routes are adjusted for weather, ice, wildlife, and opportunity. Decisions are made in real time and rarely documented fully. Statistical models that assume consistent behavior struggle to account for this variability. What appears as deviation in data may reflect normal adaptation on the ground. Reporting practices also affect pattern formation. Some disappearances are reported immediately, others are reported after delay. Once absence becomes clear, the timing of reports influences search response and available evidence. Comparing cases without accounting for reporting lag conflates operational differences with situational ones. Agencies note this limitation in internal analyses. Data completeness varies widely. Some cases include detailed timelines, equipment lists, and communication records. Others contain only minimal information. This disparity reflects differences in documentation rather than differences in events. When incomplete cases are included in pattern analysis, gaps distort results. Excluding them reduces sample size. Neither approach resolves the issue fully. Recovery outcomes further complicate aggregation. Cases resolved through recovery of remains years later introduce different variables than those resolved quickly. Environmental exposure alters evidence, affecting what can be learned. Including delayed recoveries alongside recent ones blurs distinctions between search effectiveness and environmental persistence. Statistical clustering is sometimes observed geographically. Certain regions may show higher numbers of reported disappearances over time. These clusters often correlate with higher travel volume rather than increased risk. Popular routes, seasonal hunting grounds, and transportation corridors naturally produce more incidents. Without adjusting for exposure, such clusters do not indicate unusual conditions. Institutional caution shapes interpretation. Canadian search and investigative agencies avoid attributing meaning to apparent patterns unless supported by strong evidence. Internal reviews emphasize that correlation does not imply causation. This restraint is reflected in public reporting, which focuses on individual cases rather than aggregated narratives. Historical comparisons introduce additional complexity. Equipment standards, communication tools, and reporting systems have changed over decades. Comparing cases from different periods requires adjustment for these changes. Older cases may lack data now considered standard. This limits their integration into modern analyses. External attempts to identify patterns sometimes rely on incomplete or selective data. Media compilations or informal databases may emphasize unusual elements while omitting. Agencies reviewing such material cross-reference it with official records to correct discrepancies. Differences between informal and official data underscore the difficulty of pattern formation outside controlled frameworks. Environmental unpredictability plays a central role. Northern landscapes do not produce consistent hazard profiles. Ice thickness varies year to year. River behavior changes with precipitation. Wildlife movement shifts with climate and human activity. These factors influence risk in ways that are not captured by static models. Search outcomes themselves resist patterning. Some extensive searches yield nothing. Others locate subjects quickly under similar conditions. Variability in detection is influenced by timing, chance, and visibility. These elements cannot be normalized across cases. They introduce randomness that overwhelms subtle trends. Agencies use case comparison primarily for procedural improvement. Reviews focus on how searches were conducted, rather than on why disappearances occurred. Lessons address coordination, documentation, and safety. They do not aim to identify explanatory patterns across cases. This focus aligns with operational mandates. Academic research on northern disappearances exists but remains cautious in its conclusions. Studies often note small sample sizes and heterogeneous data. Recommendations emphasize prevention through preparedness rather than prediction. This reflects recognition of analytical limits rather than lack of effort. Community narratives sometimes suggest recurring themes based on shared experience. These narratives preserve local knowledge but do not translate easily into formal analysis. Agencies respect this knowledge while maintaining separation between observation and inference. Informal patterns remain contextual rather than generalizable. When agencies report statistics publicly, they accompany them with qualifiers. Numbers are presented with explanation of scope and limitation. This practice aims to prevent overinterpretation. It acknowledges that numerical similarity does not equal situational similarity. In unresolved cases, the absence of pattern is itself documented. Analysts note when aggregation fails to yield insight. This acknowledgement prevents continued pursuit of explanatory models that do not fit the data. It redirects attention toward case-specific understanding. Pattern formation requires repetition under comparable conditions. Northern disappearances rarely meet this requirement. Each case intersects with unique combinations of place, time, and activity. Attempts to standardize these elements flatten essential differences. As a result, agencies treat each disappearance as distinct. Files are managed individually. Comparisons are made cautiously and for limited purposes. The lack of overarching pattern does not hinder operational response. In this context, the absence of pattern is not a gap to be filled. It is a characteristic of the data. Recognizing this allows agencies to focus on documentation, preparedness, and response, rather than on explanatory frameworks that exceed available evidence. What search teams can and cannot know. Northern search operations are built around defined limits of knowledge. These limits are not philosophical. They are operational boundaries shaped by evidence, environment, and time. From the first report onward, search teams work within what can be confirmed, what can be inferred cautiously, and what cannot be determined at all. These categories remain distinct throughout an operation. What search teams can know begins with verifiable facts. A departure time may be confirmed by a witness or a log entry. Equipment carried may be listed by family members or documented through purchase or registration records. Weather conditions can be reconstructed from station data and pilot reports. These elements form the initial factual frame. They are treated as fixed points unless contradicted by new evidence. Location information occupies a narrower category. A last known position may be exact if derived from a satellite transmission or recorded navigation data. More often, it is approximate, based on observation or habit. Search teams document the level of certainty associated with each location reference. A confirmed coordinate and an estimated area are not interchangeable. This distinction guides planning and is preserved in records. Movement between known points is where knowledge becomes conditional. Travel routes may be assumed based on typical behavior, but assumptions are labeled as such. Northern travel often involves adaptation to conditions that are not visible after the fact. Detours, stops, and changes of plan may leave no durable trace. Search teams acknowledge this uncertainty rather than attempting to resolve it through modeling alone. Detection is constrained by physics. Search teams can know where they looked, when they looked, and under what conditions. They cannot know with certainty what was visible within a searched area at every moment. Visibility varies continuously due to light, weather, and observer perception. Even comprehensive coverage does not equate to complete observation. Environmental processes impose further limits. Snowfall, wind, water movement, and vegetation growth alter landscapes independently of search activity. Teams can document conditions during their presence. They cannot reconstruct conditions during periods when no one was there. This gap is permanent. It is not filled by later observation or analysis. Time affects what can be known without providing new information. As days pass, evidence degrades or disappears. Search teams can record elapsed time and its effects on feasibility. They cannot recover information that no longer exists in recoverable form. This constraint applies equally to physical evidence and to human memory. Witness recollections change. Reports become less precise. These changes are noted rather than corrected. Search outcomes do not produce certainty by accumulation alone. Multiple negative searches reduce probability but do not eliminate possibility. Teams understand this mathematically and operationally. A searched area is not declared empty. It is documented as searched under specific conditions. This phrasing preserves uncertainty without overstating confidence. Communication data illustrates this boundary clearly. A signal received confirms transmission at a moment in time. Silence confirms nothing beyond the absence of transmission. Search teams treat both states as data points with defined meanings. They do not extend interpretation beyond what the data supports. When remains or property are found, knowledge expands, but remains limited. Identification can confirm identity. Location can confirm presence at a specific point. Condition can inform forensic assessment. These facts do not necessarily reveal sequence or cause. Search teams and investigators separate identification from explanation. The former may be achieved without the latter. Documentation preserves these distinctions. Reports are structured to separate observation from inference. When interpretation is required for planning, it is labeled and bounded. This practice prevents later readers from misreading planning assumptions as established facts. It also allows future reassessment without rewriting history. Search teams are trained to resist narrative completion. There is no procedural requirement to explain a disappearance. The mandate is to search, document, and respond to information as it becomes available. When information is insufficient to support explanation, the record remains incomplete by design. This restraint extends to internal review. After-action reports focus on process rather than outcome. They assess whether resources were used appropriately, whether safety standards were followed, and whether documentation was adequate. They do not speculate about unresolved elements. The absence of explanation is not treated as a deficiency in reporting. Technology does not eliminate these limits. Improved sensors and analytics increase detection capability under certain conditions. They do not restore lost evidence or replace observation that never occurred. Search teams incorporate new tools cautiously, aware that enhanced resolution does not equate to comprehensive knowledge. Interagency coordination reflects similar boundaries. Information shared between organizations retains its original qualifiers. Estimates remain estimates. Confirmed facts remain limited. Agencies do not elevate certainty through repetition. Each transfer preserves the original context of the information. Families often seek answers that exceed what search teams can provide. Agencies communicate within factual bounds, outlining what is known and what remains unknown. This communication avoids speculation not because of policy alone, but because speculation would misrepresent the limits of the record. Community observations add information without resolving uncertainty. Reports of sightings or discoveries are evaluated against existing facts. They may prompt action or be logged without follow-up. Their inclusion in the record expands awareness without guaranteeing resolution. In northern environments, chance plays a role that cannot be quantified. A search may succeed because conditions align briefly. Another may fail under similar effort because conditions differ slightly. Search teams acknowledge this variability without attempting to normalize it. Chance is recognized as a factor without being treated as an explanation. The distinction between what can and cannot be known remains constant throughout a case. Early stages offer more opportunity for detection, but not necessarily more certainty. Later stages offer context, but not recovery of lost information. At no point does the system cross from uncertainty into explanation without evidence. Search teams operate with acceptance of this boundary. Training emphasizes clarity about limits. Documentation practices reinforce it. Decision-making frameworks are designed to function without complete knowledge. This approach allows consistent response across cases without requiring resolution. In the Great White North, the environment sets terms that search teams do not control. Evidence may appear or remain hidden. Conditions may change or remain hostile. Time may narrow options without clarifying events. These realities define the scope of knowledge available to any operation. What search teams can know is therefore bounded by observation, documentation, and verification. What they cannot know lies beyond those bounds, unaffected by effort alone. The system is structured to respect this distinction, maintaining factual integrity without extending beyond it. This boundary does not end cases, it defines them. Each unresolved disappearance remains a documented absence shaped by what was observable and what was not. Search teams preserve that distinction as part of their responsibility. In the final state of an unresolved case, the record reflects both action and limit. It shows where certainty ends, without attempting to push past it. In northern search operations, this acceptance is not a conclusion. It is a condition under which the work is done. Thanks for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing to the channel for more videos like this one. New videos are posted regularly. You can also like the video to help support the channel, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below.